Join us as we explore the timeless debate of what makes a war just and how this concept influences our world today. Hey guys, welcome to the High Ground. My name is Fabio, and today we're talking about just war theory. Now, who doesn't know the saying, war is the mother of all evils? But I question, is war really the mother of all evils? Is there nothing that is worse than war? Well, if you follow the current societal mainstream opinion, then yeah, there are no absolute values, and hence there is nothing that is worth going to war over. Jordan Peterson would say, and I think a lot of philosophers would say, that this is a postmodernistic worldview where you deny that some type of absolute values or absolute truth can exist. I don't pertain to the worldview that there are no objective values. On the contrary, I think there is good and bad, and that people are able to recognize good and bad in this world. And this is why I follow a more than 2000-year-old tradition of Western philosophy of the just war. The concept of just war refers to the idea that war can be morally justified under certain conditions. The idea is that not all wars are equally morally bad or good, but you have a certain set of standards and conditions to make a war justified. Let's talk about the historic origins of just war first, and I'll promise you I'll keep it brief. Just war has its roots in the ancient Greek writings of Aristotle and Plato. They already wrote about the ethics of warfare and tried to really develop some rules for a war in order to be considered just. Now, these ancient writers and their theory, it is the foundation of what we consider just war theory today, but it was still a little bit wonky. For example, Aristotle had the idea that some races are slave races and any superior race could basically wage war against them in order to enslave them because that's where they have to be. Now, this concept of just war was further developed by early Christian thinkers, such as Augustine of Hippo or Origen, who argued that war could be just if it is waged within a certain rule set with the right means for the right reason. Throughout the centuries afterwards, a lot of philosophers and thinkers have written about the just war. One of the most important was Thomas Aquinas. He argued that war could be just if it is fought in self-defense or to protect the innocent. And this actually leads us to the criteria of just war in modern theories. According to modern theories, and this is where we are right now philosophically, just war has to meet certain criteria, or a war has to meet certain criteria in order to be considered just, to phrase it better. First of all, you need a just cause. That means the reason why you go to war has to be legitimate. Namely, this can be self-defense or the protection of the innocent. So we see a lot of the thinking of Thomas Aquinas here. The second thing, you need the right intention for going to war. This is not so much the reason that you're going, but that you want to, in the end, achieve a lasting peace and not only pursue your country's own interests. The third requirement is that war is the last resort. Any peaceful means must have been tried and failed. Of course, we can always say, yeah, if somebody invades you and you just run away, then you have another peaceful mean. But it has to be peaceful means to remedy the situation for which you are going to war, right? So you have to have peaceful means to defend you or peaceful means to protect the innocent. Not any peaceful mean, basically laying on your back and dying, um, is an appropriate measurement to achieve that goal. So we're talking about peaceful means to get to the desired end state. The fourth requirement is proportionality. The harm you cause by waging this war has to be proportional with the good that you want to achieve with it. Next point, you need a reasonable prospect of success. That means you can't just wage a war when it has no chance of being successful, because that would be obviously a waste of human life. And then the last point, it has to be declared by a proper authority. If people are going to war, then some representative of the people has to have declared that war. That would, for example, be a little bit difficult with, let's say, the Council of the EU, because they're, for example, not elected. But of course, the governments of most EU countries are elected. And I think it's the same for the Senate and the House of Representatives for the United States. So you need somebody who represents the people to declare the war. Not anybody can do it. There are certain theories that want to have further requirements for a just war. There is a little bit an argument there. Um, a lot of the theories additionally ask you to differentiate between combatants and non-combatants. You're not allowed to attack infrastructure that is not meant for war, for example, bombing historical sites just for the fun of it or out of spite. Um, but I would say this is all already considered within the international law, right? Um, the Hague Convention on Land Warfare and all those other conventions, which regulate not when you're able to go to war, but if you're going to war, this has to happen, right? We want to play according to these rules. You don't kill enemy soldiers who surrender, etc. All this stuff. So I personally would include these fair play rules for war within the requirements for a just war. Now, I'm not fully sure if we had a war in the last 100 years that really stood up to all those requirements and that could be considered a just war. Because even the war that, for example, I would consider just, to rid the world from the evil of Nazism, right? From the Third Reich. Even there, we sometime had on the Allied side and for sure on the Soviet side actions taken that would not be in line with the requirements for just war. Let's, for example, look at the bombardment of Dresden from the Allied side, or, of course, anything that the Red Army did in Eastern Germany. We don't have to even talk about those atrocities. So that's a little bit an issue there, but in my opinion, already conceding that there is something like a just war and there are really things that are worth fighting for, is a step in the right direction and should take us away from the current culture that actually nothing is worth fighting for, and the only thing that you have to make sure is that you don't offend anybody. And yes, I'm a little bit facetious here. Now let's look about some contemporary debates and some criticism on the just war theory. The first criticism that we often see is that the modern war has a whole different intensity than the war that was actually known back to the old philosophers. right? Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the Middle Ages, or even back in the ancient time, the Greek philosophers. Now, this is true. We have a different war now, um, at least with the beginning of the total warfare in the First and Second World War. Um, War got a different character in terms that it was um, really including anything that the enemy has. But that doesn't devalue the theory of just war. On the opposite, it makes it more value because, as we just said, the theory of just war um, requires that you limit against whom you wage war, that you only wage war if you have a chance of success, right? So yes, war has been or has changed, and war is different now than it was 1,000 years ago. But the basic philosophical truth that it is possible to fight, or that you should fight for something, that still stays true. So I don't see why a change in warfare would change those principles. Now, another criticism, especially from a pacifistic point of view, is that war necessarily leads to people dying, and death is the worst thing that can happen to a human being, and therefore you can't justify war ever. Now, this this view has something to it, namely the very idea that the life of a soldier is not worth more or less than the life of a civilian. Um, Now, that is true, and I would go as far and say that it will be difficult to actually conscribe people for an offensive war and still be in the realm of a just war, right? I don't really see that happening. Um, but I don't share the point that dying is the worst thing that can happen to a human being. If we look back um, only in the last century, right? Um, I would assume that a lot of the people that were in concentration camps might have preferred to die on the battlefield compared to dying in a concentration camp. Or even, I would prefer for me to go to war and die, but my family being safe. So for me, the worst thing that can happen to me is not that I die. The worst thing that can happen is actually that people that I love die, right? And so there should be a justified means with which I can defend these people, and that's the just war. And the last criticism I read is, and of course there are many more, I'm just picking out the main ones, um, is that it is very difficult to apply the principles of just war in practice. This is true, and it should be difficult. It should not be easy to go to war. War is a bad thing. It is still a bad thing, right? And if it would be easy to justify a war, then I think the theory wouldn't be worth much. So this is why this theory has very strict criteria in order to justify any war. And I think it's not something that speaks actually against this theory, but it speaks for this theory, that it is so hard to actually justify war. Okay, that's already the end of this video. Um, I think just war theory shows beautifully the richness of our Western philosophy and the tradition that we have within the Judeo-Christian frame of thinking. Um, of course, there are also other philosophy streams that have contributed to theories about war, but I think the one we developed here in the West is really, really good. And yeah, I hope you found it interesting. So we went over the history from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas. We looked at the requirements of a just war, and then we looked at some of the criticisms. Um, I hope you found this video valuable. I'm doing stuff that is more towards philosophy, preparedness, um, partially self-defense, etc. on Thursdays, while Monday is more the day for outdoors and mountain stuff. And yeah, if you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. Remember to follow the channel, that helps a lot. Click the notification bell. I really appreciate the time you spent here watching this video, and I'll see you next time.